Perfect. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back to our Radiate Up show live Thursday. I am Dr. Judy, along with my co-host, Portia and Young, behind the scene there, as always. Tonight, it is going to be an amazing night for all of us to be awakened of understanding what is our true constitutional rights. And we are so honored to have our very special guest, Dr. David Martin, who have 2 pages of an amazing credentials. I'll just briefly highlight some of the things that he has accomplished. Dr. David Martin is the founder and chairman of the MCAM Inc., the international leader in innovation finance, trade, and intangible asset finance. He also founded several for-profit and non-profit companies and organizations and served on several boards. He is a co-chair of the ADC, Australia Davos Connection, Forums Leadership, Retreat and Critical Infrastructure, and Cybersecurity Councils. Dr. David also served as the Constitutional and Economic Advisor to the Autonomy Committee of East New Britain and New Ireland, Papua New Guinea. He has worked with ethical trade frameworks for the Kingdom of Tonga, Independent State of Samoa, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. His work has been the subject of 2 internationally awarded documentaries. The one, Patent Wars, which highlights his work on reform of global innovation system and future dreaming. This is where you have a conversation with Dr. Martin about humanity and its optimal interactions in the universe. He has spoken at the United Nations General Assembly on citizen-led peacemaking initiatives and has been featured on Bloomberg televisions as well as HBO last week tonight with John Oliver. And of course, Dr. Martin is a speaker, author, business executive, and futurist. And he has engaged in every country on earth. It is so, we are so honored to have Dr. Martin here with us tonight. Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Thank you, Judy. It's lovely to be here.
Well, there's so much to talk about, and you have been such a pioneer in like breaking down step-by-steps of what is going on with the COVID-19. And as we speak earlier about some of the things that our government is putting in place. So can you share with us about some of our constitutional rights and what are they and how can we take part in this whole situation right now?
Well, yes, and I think it's helpful to start with a rather simple kind of background view of the public health laws in the United States. A lot of people don't spend much time considering that. It is something that is typically very politicized around the specifics around vaccination. Yeah. Not surprisingly, that's a point of significant contention. And so, unfortunately, an enormous amount of what is discussed in the public health arena has been highly polarized around whether people should or shouldn't be exposed to vaccinations. And that's kind of where I think an enormous amount of very superficial conversation happens. But public health has a significant history in both public policy as well as in judicial review, largely coming out of periods after the Civil War, beginning probably most significantly in terms of the law at the turn of the last century. There were a series of outbreaks of all sorts of things. I mean, obviously in the last few weeks, all of us have been exposed to the conversations around what was called the Spanish influenza. Mm-hmm. Any careful examination of the literature suggests that also co-occurred and had a significant amount of morbidity that included the tuberculosis outbreaks that were very common during the exact same period. So we are aware of those kinds of things anecdotally. And then obviously more recently, we're aware of the the Asian influenza in 2002. We're aware of the swine flu influenza outbreak that took place a few years later. And then obviously in 2012 and 2013, MERS. A few years later, Ebola in parts of Africa. And then what we're experiencing right now. But in terms of public health law, it's important to understand that the law is very clear that to establish a public health emergency, which is when the governors of states and the federal government have the right and the authority to take certain steps and certain actions in a limited fashion, there are requirements that are set forth in the law that say that certain conditions must be met. Those conditions cannot be merely the suspicion of a thing. They have to be an evidence-based approach. And one of the problems that we have in the current situation is that, unfortunately, a presumption of a particular pathogen and a presumption of a particular set of illnesses potentially associated with that pathogen were deemed to be the basis for an epidemic and pandemic declaration without meeting well-established legal criteria to do so. Now, the reason why that's important is that under public health emergencies, and this, by the way, varies state by state. In some instances, states have broad rights to essentially suspend various constitutional protections and civil liberties. In other states, that's not the case. And so one cannot paint with a single brush every state. As an example, in the state of Virginia, for example, in our Commonwealth, the only constitutionally protected right, which is part of the amendments to the Constitution, is the Second Amendment. Ironically, the only thing that survives a declaration of a state of emergency issued by a governor here is the right to bear arms. Now, what precisely that does in terms of good for a public health emergency, I'm not entirely sure, but this is an example of the nuance that happens. So in the Commonwealth of Virginia, for example, there are very specific rights that are preserved and various rights that are not. But the point that needs to be understood by everyone is that no government at the federal or at the state level is legally authorized to suspend the Constitution. They can implement rules and guidelines that are evidence-based for the public good if the evidence supports that. And unfortunately, in the current situation, it was not physically possible for the evidence that is required to institute declarations of epidemic or pandemic, and it was not possible to confirm the presence or absence of a particular viral outbreak at the time that governors and federal officials took action. It wasn't until the 2nd of March, 2020, that the International Committee on Taxonomy of Viruses published their official statement identifying SARS-CoV-2 as a unique pathogen. And what we are seeing repeatedly in studies that are being done is that we had no knowledge in terms of prevalence or in terms of potential exposure to how much coronavirus was native in the population. So to declare that there is a problem, you have to actually have an evidence that there is a problem. And the evidence that we do have is that we had a high number, not an alarmingly high number, but we did have a high number of atypical pneumonia cases that were leading to significant hospitalization, in some cases death, this year. By the way, still less in number than we had in 2017 and 2018, but we did have a high number. And what transpired was unfortunate because in a rush to declare this an emergency, scientists violated their own standards of practice and ultimately infused into the public discourse a great deal of fear and panic, which was not justified, and under the arguments I've made on numerous occasions, was an act of domestic terror. That act of domestic terror definition says that anybody who seeks to coerce a community, a citizenship, into any form of oppression, and anyone who seeks to use an act of terror to influence or shape public policy is actually violating Section 802 of the Patriot Act. And there is no question that public health officials, governors, and elected officials took part in a terrorization move that had no basis in evidentiary fact.
In lay term, for those of us who don't have the knowledge in depth of what you were saying, and I know you mentioned about the Attorney General also sent the letter about what you just mentioned about the Constitution's, meaning that in the situations, the government is imposing this stay-at-home policy is not within our constitutional rights. They have violated that, correct?
No, and it's worse than that. Not only is there a requirement for public health laws to kick in, there's a requirement that says that you have to establish that there is in fact a bona fide reason. So we have the first issue, which is there actually a reason to declare an issue? And obviously for a host of reasons, the answer is no one had the information. So on the first instance, the declaration of an emergency was done based on dubious or outright false information. So that's one issue. But the second issue, which is equally important, is that governors are restricted in their public health actions to only take scientifically validated steps to instill whatever policies they have to deal with whatever epidemic or pandemic they face. And we know that there is no science whatsoever that has ever been done that validates the use of quarantining of a healthy population. The stay-at-home order is illegal in its principle and it's illegal in its application because there is no evidence, no clinical evidence that has ever been presented that ever has established that quarantining a healthy population has any effect on anything. That's number one. And number two, the Surgeon General, the Journal of the American Medical Association, Dr. Anthony Fauci himself at NIAID has explicitly on numerous occasions stated that there is no justification for a healthy population to wear masks. Mm-hmm. Those are printed, those are published, and those are oral records where the top medical experts in America have all confirmed that those steps of wearing face masks have no evidence to support their use among a healthy population. The two steps that governors took, the quarantining of a healthy population and the face mask initiative, both directly violate published, public, and peer-reviewed information saying that neither one of them has any empirical evidence of working whatsoever. That means that every governor who issued stay-at-home orders and every governor that issued orders to wear face masks did so as a practicing of medicine, which no governor in any state is authorized to do. There has never been, nor is there any waiver of medical practice standards in any state that says that a governor can overrule medical science and come up with their own determinations of what they think people should do. That is not legal. And so, unfortunately, good science and well-meaning individuals have participated in defrauding the public, and governors are complicit in doing it.
Dr. David, you definitely stated, and I've been researching as well, there's a lot of epidemiologists and scientists have confirmed what you were saying. And yesterday, New York, Governor Cuomo stated that they had over 1,000 patients admitted with the COVID, and 66% of them were from people who were staying home. So,
listen, here's the problem. This entire epidemic or pandemic or panic, regardless of what you want to call it, this is entirely based on computer simulations done by individuals who are desperate to have funding for their enterprises and their organizations and their universities and their foundations flow to them. So Johns Hopkins University, the Imperial College of London, which has now been disgraced because of the actions of its senior scientists, the University of Washington, all of these organizations have taken a stand that specifically and explicitly is linked to those individuals who have a financial incentive to make their computer models work. And when empirically the CDC's tests failed, because they did, the World Health Organization tests have been inconsistent, which they are. Every time those things have rolled out, the response has been, let's make up numbers. Let's inflate numbers. Let's do all sorts of things. And once again, trap people in this very confusing set of double and triple standards, where what counts as a COVID death is one thing, what counts as a COVID patient is another thing. This entire branding exercise as a public health exercise has been mismanaged and mishandled. And the argument, as you know, that I've made considerably is this was something that was premeditated, and it was acts that were done by unethical and unscrupulous individuals going back to the beginning of this calamity in 2001.
I have a couple of patients who are in the health care industry, but like you were saying, that there's no evidence based about wearing a mask, how it's really protecting them, but it's actually making the healthcare worker worse. The doctor, the nurses, they had to run to the bathroom several times to just take the mask away from so that they can get some oxygen. And it's so interesting how now they make it like even going to the grocery store, you need a mask.
Yeah. Well, and the U.S. Attorney, the U.S. Surgeon General, and the Journal of the American Medical Association continue to say and continue to publish the evidence that says there is no medical evidence for this intervention. This is about compliance to very specific power-hungry governors' orders and desires. This is about crowd control. It is not about public health. No one in the public health arena can point to a single piece of evidence to justify any of these things that do not explicitly and exclusively come from computer simulations where these things are merely simulated. Nobody has clinical evidence. Nobody has any basis for this. And it is being done merely as a way to cower a population into submission. That is not acceptable, and it is unethical, and it undermines credible science. It undermines credible epidemiologists. It undermines credible public health individuals. And the fact that public health individuals, by and large, have remained on the sidelines silent is a tragedy, because what they're doing is they're actually allowing the public to be abused, which is going to worsen the public's perception of public health in the event of a real emergency.
I totally agree with you 100% on that aspect. What are some of the things that viewers, and they say thank you for speaking up, like in our state right now, the governor are putting this stay at home, and he's going through the phases, and every phase takes 3 weeks, which is ridiculous. Small businesses are hurting, and they're asking us to wear masks when it's actually reducing our ability to increase the oxygen intake. So there's a lot of health risk factors in that too. But as healthcare professionals, you have to follow the governor guidelines. So what are the rights with the people who don't know their rights? What can the public do?
Well, as you know, Attorney General William Barr made it abundantly clear that the Department of Justice has every intention of pursuing governors or mayors or other officials who have overreached and actually have gone beyond their constitutional rights. I think it is extremely important for individuals to realize that there is a court wherever you are where ultimately your claim can be heard and ultimately your case can be decided. Unfortunately, we've had this horrific tradition now of the last several decades where people live in such fear of being cited for a fine for violating a particular order, or feel that they somehow are constantly in fear of something being done by the police or the sheriff or whatever else. The fact of the matter is, the rights of a citizen are protected. And the rights of a citizen are protected through a series of steps. And the fact that some sheriff or police officer or public health agent who has an identity around being a tough guy or a bully comes in and does whatever they choose to do has no basis in the law. And as it has no basis in the law, individuals need to stop cowering around something which is the enforcement of acts that have no legal standing. The fact of the matter is, at some point, the legal profession is going to have a few individuals who have the courage to take on cases. The medical and the commercial and the other sectors of the economy are going to have some cases, and they are going to be conflict in which the rights of an individual are going to be held in a trial somewhere. That's going to happen. People need to remember that in California, the most egregious violations that have happened to date, with Gavin Newsom, who is without question the most aggressive and the most in error and the most currently exposed to the illegal acts that he has done. In 1900, there was a Supreme Court case, and the Supreme Court case was titled Juho versus Williamson. That's Jewho v. Williamson. It was decided in 1900. And this was a case that very clearly set out the standard that says that one subpopulation of individuals cannot be held while another group of individuals or another sector of group of individuals can move about freely. As you know, the executive orders and the stay-at-home orders in every state included two classes of citizens. The two classes of citizens were deemed capriciously to be essential or non-essential. Now, that violates the principle that was upheld in the Supreme Court on the case Juho v. Williamson. And ironically, the Center for Disease Control, in their own internal briefings and in their own internal memo, spent an enormous amount of time talking about this case, but no one else does. CDC knows that this is a problem. CDC knows that there is illegality in setting up standards that go too far in segregating populations. So they write their internal memos and they have their own internal presentations around these kinds of things, but the public is not informed of their rights. And we have a situation where we created a two-tier system in every state where stay at home meant stay at home unless we tell you you don't have to. Once again, no public health officer is actually among the 30 million people unemployed. You know why? Because they get paid. They get paid to stay at home. They get paid to do their job wherever they do their job. There is no economic harm to any of the individuals who are making these determinations because they are determined to be essential. And it turns out that the class of citizens who has decided all of these things has the convenience of being paid while 30 million Americans lose their jobs. We have, in fact, created a two-tier system which is in violation of the Juho v. Williamson 1900 case. And that is a public health case. That is a public health case that the CDC is fully aware of, and no one is talking about it.
So in that situation, if, let's say, the public watching your video and says, okay, there's a case that was being tried in the 1900s, so I'm going to disobey the governor, and if it goes to court, and as we saw, like in Texas, the salon lady, she was sentenced to 7 days in prison because she needed to make money for her family. But then we saw a case in Florida where it was being discharged because they don't have any valid, like you were saying. So how do you?
So let's there's a little bit of legal background that people need to understand. The problem that we have with these anecdotal legal cases is that, unfortunately, people don't understand that judges make decisions based on the case that is presented. Okay? That's the way the law is set up. Now, we may agree or disagree with whether that's right, but unfortunately, if you argue a case, the judge makes a decision based on the case that is argued. If you are going to win this case, you have to challenge the legality of the law. You cannot sit there and just say, but I wanted to, get paid, or I wanted to keep my business open, or I wanted to do this, or I wanted to do that. The law must be argued, and a judge must hear an actual case. And unfortunately, many of these cases that we see anecdotally are lawyers who are mishandling the situation. They are trying to make some sort of plea for leniency on somebody based on their desire to work, or their desire to move about freely, or their desire to congregate in a particular way. But the problem is they're not arguing the actual violation of the constitutional protections that are afforded every citizen. They are not arguing the cases about the legality of the governor's mandates and orders. And if you don't have a case that argues those issues, then you are not setting precedent. All you're doing is wasting time and ultimately harming the entire process. So it's very important for listeners to understand that this is not about just saying, I wish I didn't have to stay home, or I wish I could continue to keep my business open, or I wish something else. If somebody comes in and tries to close down your place of business, if somebody comes in and tells you that some version of your social distancing or your face mask wearing or whatever else is actually not compliant, you have to challenge the legality of the order in the first place. You cannot do it based on an argument that just says, I don't want to comply. Because not wanting to comply is going to never be decided in your favor.
So, Dr. Martin, for lay people, when you're talking about the legality, and let's say in the state of Washington, the governor set rules because he's basing his information from the University of Washington. Obviously, that's science. And we know that that science isn't as what the rest of the epidemiologists around the world were saying. So how would lay people argue or use it to be able to go about doing their own business?
Listen, the University of Washington lied to the governor.
Okay.
They lied to the governor. They projected models of infection. They projected models of fatalities that bore no resemblance to reality. They continually revise their models. If the governor is in fact committed to science-based research, then the governor should also reflect science-based adjustments in the rulings that the governor is making. The problem is that's not happening. As with everyone else, what happened was the models projected a horrific situation that did not materialize. Remember, Governor Cuomo in New York publicly lied on repeated occasions, saying that New York was going to be 30,000 ventilators short. Okay. Now, setting aside the fact that a lot of medical professionals are reporting that ventilation, particularly mechanical ventilation and invasive ventilation, was actually potentially harmful to a number of patients. But setting that fact aside, in the most egregious estimates, the ICUs and the ventilator requirements on the worst projected peak in the first 2 weeks of April involved no more than 1,100 ICU patients that might be candidates for ventilation. 1,100. And that was at the worst moment. But the governor repeatedly stated that he needed 30,000 ventilators. He did that based on the lies that were told by the University of Washington, by Johns Hopkins University, and by the Imperial College of London. These lies, and they are lies, because unfortunately, when a scientist gives people information and fails to completely deliver the range of error and the assumptions of the model that could be wrong, when that happens, then a falsehood has happened. And in Washington and in California and in Virginia and across the country, governors took false statements, rendered then errant judgments on those false statements, and when they were proven to be false, you'll remember when the University of Washington came out and said, oh, we got our model wrong. When the Imperial College of London said, we were probably off by an order of magnitude, right? No governor appropriately responded and said, if the model was wrong, I should reconsider. There is not a governor that instituted a stay-at-home order that can credibly say they have done their order based on science. Because if they had, when the science changed, their rules would have changed too. But that didn't happen.
Right.
And as that didn't happen, the governors have indicted themselves for the frauds that they are, and they have reinforced the frauds that the scientists allegedly, in fact, perpetrated on the public.
So in that situation, if the governor have created or committed the fraud, what is the role of our attorney general in the state?
Well, the role of the attorney general in the state, just like the role of the attorney general in the United States, is to be the highest enforcement law officer within the judicial system in the state. Their job is to actually be the people's attorney. And that's very important. Their job is not to defend the government. Their job is to be the people's chief attorney.
But we're not hearing them stepping up to say, okay, the governor have stepped out of bound.
Well, but that is part of the passion for what I'm doing, which is I'm saying to every person who listens to the videos, who gets the documents, who does anything else, this is a time for citizens to act. The reason why I produced the video I did 2 weeks ago was to lay out a series of facts. The series of facts that I laid out are exactly that. They are merely a series of facts. I laid them out in a coherent legal argument based on the understanding of both antitrust and constitutional law. Now, I will be the first to tell you that my interpretation is exactly that. It's my interpretation. And any other attorney is welcome to interpret the information however they choose to. Unfortunately, I have not seen any other attorney, I have not seen any other law enforcement officer, and I have not seen any attorney general or U.S. attorney in any state actually make a legal argument against what I've said. I've seen people say, well, I think he's crazy. I think I disagree with him. But not a single person has pointed to what they disagree with. I have received countless responses from lawyers who have told me that they think that I'm right. And I have equal numbers of lawyers who are sure that I'm wrong. The great thing about the law, and I feel like I'm quoting one of the old Law and Order episodes, But in the law, there is, the plaintiff and the defendant. There are the people versus the criminal. There are sides. And the great thing about the legal system is that it basically winds up being people on two sides of an argument, clearly seeing the same facts in different ways. That's how the legal system works. So whether you think I'm right, whether you think I'm wrong, I don't care. But you better meet me on the common playing field of facts. And unfortunately, that is missing. The people are not aware of, they're not informed of, and they're not being provided access to the facts. And that's part of the passion I have, which is ultimately let the public health officers, let the governments, let the scientists, let anybody else be right. But meet me with facts. Do not meet me with propaganda.
Well said. Well said. I believe Jung has a couple questions for you, so I'm going to turn that to him and I'll come back.
Very good.
Hi, Dr. David. I just had a question about, so we're learning as we're discovering more of these laws and our rights. What should we do? What should we do as citizens against these unlawful acts? And how do we exercise our rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. And bear in mind that you as an individual person, by virtue of being a citizen, have rights. You don't have to fight for them. You don't have to access them. There is a thing in the United States, which is not necessarily the case in every country, but here it is, where you, by virtue of being a citizen, have rights, and those are your rights. So the Constitution enumerates what those rights are, and you have them. There are provisions, and as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, there are provisions where certain ones of those things can be suspended for cause for a short period of time in certain limited ways. But the fact of the matter is, in this particular situation, for the reasons I have articulated before, those rights have been suspended, not consistent with the application of the law. And as such, you just have your constitutional rights. You have your right of free speech. You have your right to bear arms. You have your right to the freedom of assembly. You have your right to not incriminate. You have all of your rights. These are all things that are yours. And that includes you have the ability to make sure that as a citizen, you inform yourself and you inform others of the fact that those rights cannot be taken, right? When the United States Attorney General says that, when all of the facts are presented that say that, when court cases like the one in the 109th District in Illinois are decided in the favor of the people, those are the facts. And the problem we have, and the reason why I'm so passionate about this, is we don't inform ourselves of these facts. We have ceded to this scheme, this branded campaign of crowd control. We have ceded to that our rights. That's on us. And that means that we have to act differently. And as I did 2 weeks ago, what I have done is I've prepared a series of documents. Those documents can be downloaded off the YouTube site. They can be shared. A lot of different organizations are printing them out. They're sending them around to their members. They're doing all sorts of other things. And those documents can go to elected officials. They can go to your mayor. They can go to your U.S. attorney. They can go to the attorney general. They can go to the district attorneys that you have in your region. They can go to your governor's office. They can go to your public health officers. They can go to your elected officials, your congressmen and your congresswomen and your senators. The fact of the matter is the public has to take its responsibility to be a citizen. And being a citizen does not mean sitting and watching your rights be taken from you. It means standing up for your rights and making sure that you've communicated them. There is nothing about this particular situation that justifies the suspension of any citizen's constitutional rights. And if those are being taken, then it is incumbent on all of us to inform ourselves and then alert the system around us, that we are not willing to let our rights be suspended. That's an action step. That is something that every person can do.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yep.
All right, Dr. David, there's a couple questions here. It says, why are our rights being abrogated? Who is directly benefiting from this global control? And why are the governor maintaining the fraud?
Well, there's an enormous amount of economic incentive for this coming from three different sectors. I've spent considerable time over the last few weeks talking about the fact that the Center for Disease Control, the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease, NIAID, which is Anthony Fauci's organization, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, a number of nonprofit and for-profit companies, and a number of universities have economically benefited from this particular fraud. They have directed public funds into a pandemic that they created. And they did it so that they could get funding. So in terms of one group of organizations, there are people who allege to be scientists. There are people who allege to be independent researchers who have financial gain directly from creating, maintaining, and perpetuating this particular COVID-19 branded campaign. That is one group of actors. On the exact same hand, we have a number of people who are actually using this distraction for their other agendas. And this is, by the way, a very common thing to see happen. There are an enormous number of situations where we have seen social media and other technology companies who are accessing information, who are using information, who are specifically harvesting this information to understand dynamics of crowd behavior. This is another group that is benefiting. And so the ability to watch how humans react to a series of contrived experiments, which is what this is, that is another group that benefits. And that's the clear evidence around the social media campaigns. But it's also, if you look at the media companies, the major networks, you look at the control and interest of those particular organizations, you see that they are held very closely by overlapping directors, and they are held very closely by the same number of investors. This huge number of overlaps. And so there is a group of people who financially benefit from being the message carriers. So that's another group. And then the third group is financial institutions that are receiving unprecedented amounts of wealth in terms of access to capital and money that are benefiting because all of this is happening below, right? We have 30 million people unemployed. Allegedly, we put $2 or $3 trillion into the market to allegedly help people. But if you look at what actually went to small business, for example, it was less than 20% that even has a dotted line of going to small business. If you look at what actually happened to small business, what happened to small business was creating debt to banks. We weren't helping small business. What we were doing was indebting small business to banks, once again creating the debt-based asset system that ultimately will be the second round economic harm. So we have a financial group that is also benefiting richly. And the thing that we need to understand is each one of those players is both perpetrating and benefiting from this particular campaign. One of the things I'm very careful in doing is not to say that one is the bad actor, because it is an ecosystem of opportunistic bad actors. And there is no question that if you're in public health right now, particularly if you have expertise in coronavirus, this is the greatest day in the universe, because you're going to get hundreds of millions of dollars of grants. You're going to get money poured by the hundreds of millions and billions into vaccine production, into drug production, into all kinds of other interventions. So this is a massive gold mine for the people who are going to be opportunistic there. This is a massive gold mine for people who control the airwaves, control the cable access, control the digital content platforms. It's a massive win for them, because what do we all have right now? When we're staying at home, we have the monitors and we have the TVs and we have the computers and we have the handheld devices. We are being taken for a ride by the organizations that are benefiting there. And the financial institutions have so thoroughly co-opted this thing to get billions and now trillions of dollars that are flowing into banks and financial institutions right now. And no one is asking the question, what oversight is being done with that money? Nobody's asking that. The people, and that means you and me, the citizens of the United States, ultimately have to pay that money back. We have to. That's the 22 to 23% of the entire national budget, which will be required to pay back the debt that did none of us any good. We are getting taxed in our futures for a absolutely contrived scenario in our present.
Wow.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Portia.
Can I ask a question? Okay.
Certainly.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Martin. So in your best judgment, from everything that you've presented and you've researched and everything, from the very beginning, there was no real basis. Are you saying this for WHO, CDC, anybody to label this a pandemic?
Yeah, so let's be really precise about this. So a pandemic would suggest that a new virus or a new pathogen, a bacteria or anything else, was emerging and was directly responsible for a particular outbreak. This has happened in the past, and there have been moments where a infection of whatever it was, viral or bacterial, entered the population and had a huge effect. That has happened in the past. What I'm saying very specifically is this, that by 2016, we have ample evidence that researchers, both in the United States and in China, were actively manipulating coronavirus to increase its virulent properties. That is not a question, and that is not a projection. That's actually evidenced in scientific publications, in grants submitted and funded by the National Institute of Health in the United States and the Center for Disease Controls in China. We have the evidence that the things that we know make the SARS coronavirus pathogenic. We know there are two properties. One is called a spike protein, and one is called the ACE2 receptor. It's the binding site. Okay? We know that coronavirus in 2002 and 3, MERS coronavirus in 2012 and 13, and we know other expressions of coronavirus, in fact, infect the human being through a common pathway. What we do not know, and what is clearly evidenced in all of the science, is we don't know what mutations, what adaptations, and what subspecies distinctions are more or less pathogenic. We know how to make them worse, right? Because in 2016, we published how to make them worse. In 2017, we funded studies to make them worse. In 2018, we shared those studies with the Chinese and the Chinese with us. So what we know is that coronaviruses have been in the population for a long time. What we do not know, and what no epidemiologist has the integrity to mention, is that still most of the people who die of pneumonia and febrile symptoms this year, most of those people do not have the coronavirus as described by SARS-CoV-2. Most of the people, and I want to say that again, most of the people who die of atypical pneumonia and most of the people who die of this infectious set of disorders called COVID-19, most of them do not have coronavirus as it is tested. Now, what does that mean? That means that there are potentially many different pathogens, some that we know about, some that we don't know about, but there are many out there, and we have decided to name and brand one, to build this entire facade around one, and we pay no attention to the people who die anonymously on things that are not named COVID-19. This is a very huge social and moral tragedy. We're watching real human beings suffer and die, and we are pretending that the coronavirus that we decided was significantly different enough to call it novel, which is a human distinction. Now, it's not, we don't have a set of rules. And this is really important for viewers to know. The reason why there's called a coronavirus study group for the International Committee on the Taxonomy of Viruses, the reason why there's a study group is a group of people sit down and just make a decision. Is this different enough to call it something unique? That's not a right or a wrong. They have not published a standard that says it has to be this much different before we call it different. And what we also know is that within the 39 known coronavirus species that have subphylum, which is just the subversions of those coronaviruses, we know that in this particular situation of what's called SARS-CoV-2, we know there are over 229 documented mutations of that virus. Now, do we have 229 different COVID-19s? Do we have 229 different SARS coronaviruses? What I know is that we have many more than we've counted. And we have many more than we've tested. And most of them, and this is an important way to bring down the fear level, most of the coronavirus infections don't amount to anything. Most people who are exposed to coronavirus don't even get symptoms. Most people, when they're exposed to it, have an immune system that actually responds to the virus and deals with it. The vast majority of individuals will always be exposed to pathogens, and they will always have an immune system that works most of the time. And we forget that because we're so morbidly obsessed. In an earlier interview today, I said that there is a pornographic obsession with death. This constant number count. How many people died? How many people died? How many people died? That, and the reason why I say it's pornographic is because it is socially unacceptable. It is not okay for us to obsess about the deaths of humans and make that the sole focus of 40, 50, 60% of our news coverage every day. There's a lot happening in the world today. But go on CNN, go on BBC, go on Fox, go on any place and see how much of the landscape of the news is dedicated to death. And the fact of the matter is that tells you that somebody is trying to mind control you, to instill fear in you. And that is a message that needs to be broken. We do not need to fear coronavirus. We have lived with it. There are people who tragically get exposed to it and die. And for that, I'm deeply saddened. And as a human race, we should all be saddened. But I'm equally saddened by the diabetic and the cancer patient and the patient with heart disease and the patient who has an accident and the opioid addiction patient. And I'm equally concerned with all of them. And this obsession that goes under the guise of public health that says that somehow or another picking coronavirus and SARS is the thing we should all get wrapped up in, cheapens the human lives that are lost in every other condition. And I refuse to participate in that because the fact is we should all mourn the loss of those who we lose. We should all mourn that loss. But none of that justifies inflicting more harm on the general population. That's never justified.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's what I think too. I think the whole group, we've developed our own inner system of sharing like off media. I deleted all mainstream media off my Facebook because people are, the good thing that's happening now are people are waking up. They're like, what is going on? Exactly what you said about media. My team was telling me and I wasn't quite awoken to that. And all of a sudden I'm like, holy cow, this is a massive experiment. We need to wake up and we need to really know what our rights are. Because if we don't stand up for it, and it's not that we're not standing by this. We work with Dr. Judy has nurse patients. She's helped save a few people's lives with just presenting information.
Yeah.
And we have another nurse that's suicidal we were just given to in another part of the world. And we work with these people and we're just like, what is going on? Like if you look at the media, you're like, that's one thing. And then you go outside and you're like, it's not like that.
No.
So you really need to be like conscientious. And one thing that's great about everything is what you're doing is you're empowering people. And that's what people need to be. Empowered.
That's exactly right.
Fear is, it can be like so overwhelming right now, and people lose their mind and their soul and their heart. And we're just like, let's just keep everybody calm.
Yeah.
They can make great decisions. And before people declare certain things, does it even make common sense?
Yeah.
And so that's what I love about, there's a lot of chaos, granted. There's a lot of beautiful things that are happening in this process.
Exactly right.
And you're trying to do that. You're trying to, allow this brilliance to shine. So people like wake up and they're just like, what is going on?
Yeah.
And what can I do? And how can we come together? Because that's another thing, Doctor, that I see is people are like getting divided. And it's not
exactly right.
It's not what we need to do right now. We need to talk it out. We need to learn what is exactly our rights and who's wrong. And you're like you said, people just don't know. So you're providing that opportunity. And so we're so grateful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow, that was beautiful. We're at the top of the hour, and I want to give Dr. David a few minutes to share his information, how people can reach him. And we are so blessed to have your wealth of wisdom to share with us some of our rights. And it's sad that we are in the States that even though we know our rights, there's still that rules and regulations. But I'm going to give you the floor for the last couple of minutes to.
Yeah, well, listen, my wife Kim and I do a production every Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern time. It's called Butterfly of the Week. We live stream it on Facebook, and then it goes up on Facebook and it goes up on YouTube. The YouTube channel is David Martin World, and that's just 3 words. And just for all of your viewers, underneath each video, each week, at the Show More button, if you just click on that Show More button, all the documents, all of the independent information is all listed, so you can draw your own conclusions. As I said before, my job is to share information, not to lead to conclusions. My job is not to tell you what to do. My job is to equip you to be citizens. So that's what I'm doing. So under each video, there's always a Show More button, and inside of that are all the references. And 2 weeks ago, the video that was done, I believe on the 27th of April, if I recall correctly.
Yes.
Underneath the 27th of April link, there is a sample letter that you can draft and send to your elected officials, to state officials, to federal officials. You can draft and send that letter and equip yourself and empower yourself with more information. What I highly recommend as well as under my website, davidmartin.world, that's davidmartin.world. Under that website, you can also access an enormous amount of other content. We have a lot of information that's out there. We have a couple documentaries, as you mentioned in your opening, and I'd be happy to share those with any group at all. So Judy and the entire team, thank you for having me, and I appreciate your efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It's late over there, and we're so grateful for your wisdom again. People are starting to ask for your information, so we'll definitely have Jung put it on this link so that everybody can have them.
Beautiful.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Love you.
Have
Thank
a
you.
lovely evening. Thank you.
You as well.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.